Hello, and welcome to the first lecture of human biology. We are going to talk about human organization and answer the question, what is biology? So first, let's talk about science. I do want you to know that the definition of science is a way of knowing about the natural world, and it influences our daily life. So even if you have no interest in science, you've never had an interest in science, the way you function day to day has solely been dependent on science and scientific discoveries. So to answer the question from the first slide, biology, let's break it down. Bio just means life. And anytime you see that word ology, no matter where it is, whether it's psychology, physiology, all the ologies, that just means study of. So it is the study of life is what biology means. And I do want you to know this definition here in red, the study of living organisms and their environments. So it makes sense that human biology would just be the study of human organisms and their environments. So let's talk about what life is. There are 6 main characteristics of living organisms, and we will talk about each of these individually. So first, life is organized, and you might think like folders and color coordinating as organized. That is not what this is at all. So what it means by organization is the basic unit of structure starting at cells and then getting bigger from there. So what I want you to know, and we will keep kind of going back to this every once in a while, is that the basic unit of structure and function in living things is known as a cell. Cells together, lots of them, will make up tissues. Tissues are going to be in plants, animals, and they are groups of cells that work together to do a specific job. They can secrete things, they can cause things to move when they contract together, such as muscle tissue. They can cause thoughts, like neurons in your brain are just brain cells, right? So tissues, when you put them together, lots of them, are going to make up organs. And organs are going to be things exactly like what you think of when you think of organs: your brain, your stomach, your heart, your lungs, the list goes on. When you get a few organs together, you're going to get organ systems. And from organ systems, you're going to get an organism. So we are starting with the smallest. So know that. And it is going to the largest. So from cells to tissues to organs to organ systems, which is basically what we'll be talking about through the semester, and then you will eventually get an organism. So that is the organization that is going to define the first characteristic of life. This is just more of the same, talking about the same things, just in a different way of saying it. So we have our chemical level, which are atoms and molecules, so that's technically even smaller than cells. From there you get cellular, which is going to be our cells, and we'll talk about various things having to do with cells in the next section. Then tissues, which are groups of cells. We get an organ, which is 2 or more different tissues. From there, we get organ systems. They'll be related to the organs within the system. And then you get an organism when you have all the parts functioning together. And then you have this lovely example over here that is looking at, it looks like probably the heart and the various cells and tissues that are involved in that. The next characteristic that we're going to talk about is where organisms acquire materials and energy. So for something to be alive, you need to have an outside source of materials and energy. What I want you to think of when you think of that outside energy is food. I also want you to know what this term means here. So metabolism. Metabolism is the chemical processes that occur within a living organism in order to maintain life. So this is how your body maintains existing. You are bringing in energy, using it, and then expelling it in some capacity. And then what is the ultimate source of energy required for the majority of life on Earth to survive? What is something that you think everything on Earth actually needs? If you said the sun, you would be correct. So, starting from things that need photosynthesis, you require light for that. From there, animals will eat that, or, things that eat the animals that eat that are going to need energy that they get from those processes. So from the sun's energy going into the plants, from the plants into the animals that eat those plants, and from potentially the animals that eat the plants that need the sun. So that kind of basic food web chain that you can kind of think of. Organisms need to maintain their homeostasis. This is a very important term. It's also incredibly important concept to think about is homeostasis. So do make sure that you know the definition for this. So homeostasis is the ability to maintain relatively constant internal conditions even under extreme situations. How I like to think of homeostasis is going to be what's in red here. The optimal internal state. But I do want you to know both of those definitions, but a very baser idea of what homeostasis is that optimal internal state. So think of it this way. To survive, you must maintain a few things. Probably a little bit more than just a few things, but we'll just talk about a few. Your heart rate, so how fast or how slow your heart is beating. Your blood pressure, very important. Your water and mineral balance, as well as your body temperature is a very important one, and your blood glucose levels. There are so many more things that your body needs to maintain in order to stay in homeostasis. But these are just a few things that we can think of off the top of our head here. There are a few different types of homeostasis that I want you to know. So first and foremost, information is sent to the brain, which responds by directing a cell, tissue, or organ to perform a process to maintain homeostasis. This is if something's going wrong. We have to get it back to right. So a negative feedback is going to be where the product of a process inhibits the process. And that might sound a little bit weird as far as the phrasing goes, but think of this example. Thermoregulation. Make sure you know this term as well. Thermoregulation is regulating your body temperature. If you're too hot, you're going to sweat. If you're too cold, you're going to shiver. So by sweating, you're using evaporative cooling in order to cool down your body, okay? When you're cold and you shiver, that is going to be your muscles contracting in order to produce more body heat. So it is that thermoregulation to get you back into homeostasis, back to that normal, optimal state of being. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop is a little bit weirder to think about, but it's the product of a process which intensifies the process until that process is over. An example that I can give you is peeing or urinating, also known as micturition, but we'll talk about that later. So peeing, if you've ever tried to stop urinating midstream, you'll notice it hurts. It doesn't feel good, and that's because there's sphincters, so rings of muscle, which are trying to relax and allow the urine to flow out through the urethra from the bladder to the urethra. as well as your bladder itself, this little kind of balloon-like organ, is squeezing so that that urine comes out. So it's contracting and squeezing, trying to get that to happen. So if you clench up and you stop peeing, well, your bladder is going to keep clenching because it wants all of that urine to come out. You can't just stop that process midstream. Another example is childbirth. That's a really good example of a positive feedback loop. So what happens is the baby is going to be pushing, its head, hopefully, is going to be pushing on the cervix. That causes pain. So that pain is going to pop up into the mother's brain and say, ow, that hurts. This doesn't feel good. So let's release some oxytocin, which is this lovely little chemical that's going to cause kind of a good feeling as well as contractions. So it's causing the uterus to contract. So the uterus around the fetus, the baby, it's going to contract and push the baby's head down further, again into the cervix. From there, we're going to say, ouch, back to the brain, more oxytocin, squeezing, pushing, until the baby is out, as well as the placenta, because there is the afterbirth. But regardless, that process is going to keep going and intensifying until the entire event is over. And that is a positive feedback loop. I've had students say the best way to remember the difference between a positive and negative feedback, as far as homeostasis goes, is that a positive feedback loop doesn't sound very positive. So, i.e. childbirth and urinating. Another way, or another characteristic of organisms being alive, the characteristics of being alive, is that organisms respond to stimuli. So this is where sensory receptors detect changes in the internal environment, then the central nervous system results in an appropriate response. What I want you to imagine is touching a hot stove and then pulling your hand back really fast, or whatever part of you touched that hot stove, or possibly being startled by a loud noise. Maybe you're asleep in class and your teacher takes a book and slams it right next to your head or something to wake you up. That jolt back that you have is that startled response, as well as, you have this auditory stimulation, possibly vibrations in the desk. So you're responding to that stimuli. Another example of a stimuli that can be enacted is smelling baking, smelling food. Even thinking about food is stimulating some things. Your mouth starts to water and maybe your stomach will growl. Next up, we have organisms that reproduce and grow. This is a big characteristic of something being alive. I do want you to know what reproduction, growth, and development mean. So reproduction is the biological process by which new individual organisms or offspring are produced from their parents. We'll kind of talk about why those are in quotations a little bit later when we talk more about cells and various things. But it is the passing of genetic information from one generation to the next. You can think about this genetic information as being like you and your mom both have blue eyes, but your dad has brown eyes. So your mom passed on that genetic information to have blue eyes. For me, one of the things that I'm kind of proud of, my mom and I have the same shaped hands. The way our hands kind of, our fingers curve a little bit to the left, and our thumbs are almost identical, as well as our pinkies here. So her genetic information, kind of a weird one, is the shape of our hands. She passed it directly to me. Growth is a big important one too. Organisms that don't grow technically aren't alive, but I don't know many that don't. But this is to increase in size and often in number of cells. So you can think about development. So a human, or well, I guess probably most organisms, start off as a zygote, which is a product of a sperm cell and an ovum coming together and creating a fertilized egg. So you start off as two cells, just two, and they come together, and then they reproduce, and then they reproduce, and then they reproduce, and they reproduce until you get a fully formed fetus. Kind of exciting. But that number of cells is going to increase. In fact, up until you're, I don't know, probably 25 thereabouts, you're still producing quite a bit of cells that are new in a way, as well as you're still developing, which is the next thing. So development, so changes that occur from the time that the egg is fertilized until death. I want you to think of aging. Again, as I said, up until you're about 25, 30, you are still developing. There are still changes that occur. Not to mention, even after that, there are still changes that occur. They're not always in a good development way, potentially. Aging isn't always the most fun, but that's part of being alive, right? So next up, organisms will have an evolutionary history. So do you know what these terms mean, please? Evolution is the process by which a population changes over time. How things adapt, which is that third term I want you to know. So adaptation is the biological mechanism by which organisms adjust to new environments or to change in their current environment. And then I do want you to know what natural selection is. It's the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So you can think of survival of the fittest if you want to there. So speaking of evolution, this is kind of an interesting little phylogenetic tree, which I do want you to know that that's what that is, and I'll spell it for you. Whoop, there's a C here. So there's a phylogenetic tree. So the way that this works is over here on the left, branching off to the left, we have bacteria. Branching off from the middle here, we have archaea, and then over to the right, coming up further this way, we have eukarya. Now, eukarya is where all the fun stuff is. That's going to be things like fungi and plants, and you'll even notice right here, animals. So this is where we are and where we fit in. And this is how we're kind of related to other creatures. So all animals are related in various parts to various things, such as fungi and plants, ciliates, and then we have flagellites here, so little cells that have little tails, kind of like sperm. But yeah, so kind of interesting stuff, how we relate to other creatures. I do want you to think a little bit about viruses and how are they living? Do they live? Are they considered living organisms? This is actually a pretty fun debate that has come up in various scientific circles. So think about it yourself. We have our characteristics of living organisms over on the left there. And then we have some of the boxes that maybe they check and some boxes that they actually don't as far as viruses go. They don't grow. They don't respond to stimuli. They're parasitic. They rely on a host. Just kind of interesting to think about. So here, let's think about science as a process. So this is the scientific process or the scientific method. You use this on a day-to-day basis. And this is the process here written out. I do want you to know this in order. So first we're going to ask a question. And you can kind of do a background research. You can also just sort of make an observation that goes hand in hand with asking a question. Sometimes you can do background research, not always. It's probably good to do background research, but sometimes we just jump right in. From there, we're going to construct a hypothesis. A lot of you have probably thought of constructing a hypothesis as being an if-then statement. I want you to not think of it that way. I want you to think of a hypothesis as being a something affects something else. So when you think of something affecting something else, I want you to think of, let's say, temperature affecting metabolic rate. So temperature affecting your breathing. So would you breathe faster if you were hot? Would you breathe slower if you were cold? That type of thing. From your hypothesis, you're going to test your experiment. And if it works, awesome. Let's analyze that data and draw a conclusion. If it doesn't work, we're going to go back to the drawing board and start over, essentially. Now, not always do we use as much of the testing and conclusioning and whatnot, but you may ask a question like, why are you tired? It may be because you stayed up too late last night. Maybe you're watching videos on YouTube. Maybe you were watching TikTok. Maybe you were watching who knows what. And it kept you up really late and you had an early morning and you had to go to work. So you know that hypothesis is that potentially watching videos affects your sleep. So videos affects sleep. You came up with a hypothesis. You can test that hypothesis by going to bed early, not watching videos, etc. We can see how we do that, right? Back to a hypothesis. Again, we're just going to talk about this a little bit. We come up with a question, which is going to lead us to our hypothesis. And hypotheses will usually be stated something kind of like this. This is a really nice example. But a hypothesis itself is a tentative fact or explanation for one or more observations or questions. It must be testable, very important. It has to be falsifiable. And you never use words like always or never. So, in summary, it's not final. A hypothesis is not final. I really love this example of the scientific method. I will use this on your test because I think it's fantastic. You have these two gentlemen here, Robin Warren and Barry Marshall, and they did their project, well, not project, their experiment, over ulcers. And ulcers are going to be sores in the digestive tract. So that can be your esophagus, it can be your stomach, your intestines, the rectum, all through there. And what they were finding is that in every case of ulcers that they came across, there was this bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, which this is actually a little picture or graphic of them. And Helicobacter pylori was in every ulcer case that they came across. So they made an observation, the bacteria being present. They asked a question, which is this one right here. Is the bacterium causing the ulcers? They made a hypothesis right here. So the presence of H. pylori is causing ulcers. They tested their hypothesis. Barry decided he would drink a vial of Helicobacter pylori, probably entirely too much, more than enough. And surprise, surprise, he ended up getting ulcers. Because of this experiment and because they were basically uncontested. No one really had a better explanation. They did win the Nobel Prize in 2005 for their research. Kind of interesting. I do want you to know what the difference between a hypothesis and a theory is. A theory is going to be an untested hypothesis, as well as I want you to kind of understand that it's an untestable hypothesis. So think of like the theory of evolution. We can really support the theory of evolution with a lot of evidence, a lot of really great ideas, a lot of really great evidence. But there's no real good way to test it. In fact, there's no way to test evolution. So it is just a theory. There is also the theory of natural selection, which fits into that theory of evolution as well. I do want you to have an understanding of what makes an experiment a good experiment. Model organisms such as rats, mice, guinea pigs, etc. are really great as model organisms. You can also think of plants. Certain plants are really good model organisms. And sometimes larger mammals for like medical experiments are okay, such as dogs, pigs, or chimpanzees. Humans are also used for testing, but the question you always should ask is it ethical to test whatever you're testing on that particular animal? Or if you should be testing it on an animal. There's certain things that shouldn't be tested. And then we are going to talk about statistics. So it's how you evaluate your data. I do want you to know correlation doesn't always mean causation. That means just because something looks like it goes hand in hand doesn't mean it does. Factors that can influence your statistics is sample size. So that will be the number of whatever it is you're testing, whether that's humans, rats, whatever. It must be appropriate test for whatever it is that you are testing, and then falsified facts from researchers. Now, the big thing I want you to get from statistics is this term, significant. So what this means is that it is unlikely that the results are due to chance. The results will support the hypothesis, or they might not support your hypothesis, and that can still lead to data and a good project. Even if your hypothesis isn't supported, that just means that there's room for improvement. There's room to expand. Some stuff I want you to know as far as science goes is that research is constantly questioned through peer reviews. That means other researchers, other scientists, other biologists, other whatever it may be, is going to look at what this particular person is trying to publish and say, can I redo that? Is this really, you know, a possible thing? How did they do it? Can I recreate it? Now, I do want you to make sure that you know that term. Can it be recreated? Super important. Can it be recreated? Because in the example I'm going to give you, being the Wakefield et al. 1998 article, which was the article that talked about autism being caused by vaccines. It should be noted there were only 12 children used in this experiment. Only 12. That is an incredibly small sample size. There were a dozen plus studies done in response, and none of them could recreate the data that Wakefield found, or claims to have found. It should also be noted that in 2010, the journal retracted the article, and then it was found out that Wakefield was a fraud, and I believe he was paid off in some capacity. Regardless, it was proven to be wrong, but for some reason, this journal article got a lot of traction. A lot of people saw it and thought it was real, thought there was some validity to it. And then the last thing I want you to know is that science is always evolving. That's a no. It is always changing and evolving. And that's actually really what we're seeing a lot more recently with a lot of science going on. A lot of things are just being changed as far as journal articles, peer reviews. You can literally see science at work when it comes to COVID-19. Now, moving on into kind of more topics that we might be talking about for the rest of the semester. So I do want you to know what the term anatomy and physiology mean. Anatomy is going to be the study of the structure of the human body, and physiology is the study of the normal function of the human body. So you can think of them as these kind of broken down questions. So anatomy is what does it look like, and physiology is what does it do. I do want you to know all of the organ systems that we're going to talk about. So everything that you can see on this slide should be in your notes already. Make sure you know all of the organ systems as well as their major functions. I am going to loosely kind of talk about what each one is, kind of in layman's terms. So the integumentary system, hold on. The integumentary system, I want you to know, is skin. The skeletal system, you should kind of know, it's going to be your bones. Muscular system, pretty obvious, it's going to be your muscles. The nervous system is going to be your brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Your endocrine system is going to include your glands. Cardiovascular system is going to be your heart, blood, and vessels. Your lymphatic system is going to include your lymph nodes. There's also a few glands in there, but we'll talk about it once we get there. The respiratory system, just know that it's going to include mostly your lungs. Digestive system, there are tons of organs that are going there, but we will talk about those when we get there, but I think we all probably have a pretty good understanding of what the digestive system is. The urinary system is going to include your kidneys and your bladder. And then the reproductive system is going to be for females, the ovaries, uterus, and vagina. And for males, that's going to include the penis, testicles, we can leave it at that for now. But those are the main structures that we're going to find in those organ systems. So let's talk a little bit about anatomical terminology. Learning new anatomical terms is going to feel like learning a new language. A lot of the terms are based in Latin or Greek, so they can be a little bit confusing, but once you hear them, you might be able to kind of discern what they mean. If you can apply it to various other things that you've maybe heard, maybe you know, but we are going to use these anatomical terms for the rest of the semester. First and foremost, I want you to know what anatomical position is. It's going to be this position that this model is in. So his palms are flat, His palms are up and facing us. His shoulders are squared. His face is directly at us. He's not looking up or down. And this is going to be anatomical position. This is how you always want to imagine the model or any structures that we might be thinking of. So that sounds kind of weird. But for example, we would assume that the heart, which is somewhere about here, if we were only looking at the heart, is going to be in anatomical position. So where the top of the heart is here, where the bottom of the heart is here, and where the front of the heart is here. These are some anatomical terms that I do want you to know. You can definitely read through them yourself. But all of these are essentially kind of in relation to each other. So when you think about one, you can kind of think about what the inverse might be, as they all have something to do with each other. Sometimes they're in kind of relation to each other, such as proximal and distal. Now I will explain this one because it's a little bit confusing. So we can see on our model over here the term proximal up closer to the top of her leg, and the word distal is down here at her lower leg. So proximal is going to be closer to the point of attachment. So her thigh is proximal to her ankle. So it is closer to attachment. Distal, her ankle is distal to her thigh. Okay. So there are two separations that I want you to know about the abdomen, and that is the quadrants and the regions. Here we are seeing the quadrants. You're seeing the right upper quadrant. You'll also notice that our gentleman here is going to be essentially an anatomical position aside from his arms being down and his palms not showing, but he is in anatomical position here for us. So the right upper quadrant is his upper right, okay? So if we were just looking at him, we might say that's on the left side, but it's his right, not ours. It is the model's right and the model's left, the model's right and the model's left. So within each quadrant, I do want you to know the main organs that you're going to find there, and how I like to remember these different organs is kind of a silly thing. You can think of it as a name or something like that, but it's gill, piss, burr. And technically burr repeats because what's on the right lower quadrant is the same as the left lower quadrant. So we have the gallbladder, intestines, liver in that right upper quadrant. The pancreas, intestines, stomach, and spleen in the left upper quadrant, and in both the lower quadrants you'll have the bladder, intestines, and reproductive organs. Now you'll notice that intestines are going to be in every single quadrant, which is kind of interesting. But I'm not going to ask you to tell me whether it's small or large intestines. Just know that it's intestines. When it comes to the regions, there are 9. So the quadrants are going to be 4, but regions are going to be 9. I do want you to know all 9. The only thing I don't want you to know that is different, you don't need to know the organs that are going to be within the regions. I do want you to have maybe an idea of what the word breakdown is. The term hypo just means under. Epi is going to be above. Hyper also means above. The term chondriac is going to refer to cartilage, and you're going to see that here and here. Now, this space right here is going to be where you have cartilage from your ribs. So there is cartilage here that is attaching your ribs to your sternum, and that is what that is referring to. Gastric means stomach, chances are you knew that. Lumbar is going to be the lower back, so where you have those big vertebrae in your lower back. Inguinal is a term that means groin, so this is just talking about your groin area here. And then umbilical is going to be your belly button or your navel. So make sure you know the regions, be able to tell me right and left as long as it's the models right and left. And then here's a nice picture of the internal organs. I do want you to know all of these terms. So what I would suggest is taking the list that I give you and then writing out what each one means. A lot of these should make sense. Femoral, meaning thigh, pedal, meaning foot, manual, meaning hand. So I like to think of mani-pedis. So manual and pedal. So mani-pedi, right? Nasal is going to be your nose. Ocular or orbital means eye. Some of these might not make as much sense to you. Axillary meaning armpit. Antebrachial meaning your forearm. Antecubital meaning the front of your elbow, because the back of your elbow is something different. It is olecranal. Now I do want you to know, and it does say it on the last slide, but your toes and your fingers are your digits. I believe it states a difference. But do you know all of the terms on here? I want you to know all of them. This will be a matching question on your exam. I'm almost certain of it. These are sectional planes, so how we might view various parts of the body. So if we were looking at the head cut in half, so we could look at the brain, we would look at it as a sagittal cut. So that is separating the right and left parts. Now most of these are pretty straightforward. You should be able to read these and be able to tell which one's which. These are the body cavities that I'm going to ask you to know. I do want you to know the thoracic cavity, the cranial cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. So what these terms mean is that you have these open spaces within your chest, your head, and your abdomen. These open spaces are filled with organs. That's all it is. They're just open spaces. If we took your organs completely out of these spaces, they would just be empty pockets. That's all I want you to know. The abdominopelvic cavity, sometimes we can combine these words into abdominopelvic, and then it's right here, of course. And sometimes we just leave them separate. The abdominal cavity is going to be mostly your digestive organs, while the pelvic cavity is going to house most of your reproductive organs, as well as your bladder, I believe. We have membranes that are going to cover our organs, so that's what this term means, serous. Membranes are going to cover our viscera. Just know that viscera is just your organs. This is for protection. Both protection as well as to reduce friction. It's also going to hold organs in place. And then here we can see that there's different types of membranes. We have pleura, which are going to surround your lungs. The pericardium is going to surround your heart. This is actually a nice little depiction of it. And the peritoneum, it's going to line your abdominal cavity, the entire abdominal cavity. What's interesting about that is that you have a term called retroperitoneal, and this means behind the peritoneum. And this is where you're going to have your kidneys. Your kidneys aren't actually within the peritoneum, they are outside. If you put your hands on your back, like this, you can actually kind of put your hands on top of your kidneys. They're directly on your back, kind of at your lower back, and they're relatively superficial. And then last but not least, this is just another lovely depiction of the various cavities, how they're separated. And I do want you to pay attention to this guy over here. The diaphragm is going to be the big separation between your thoracic and your abdominopelvic cavity. Kind of interesting. And that should do it for the first lecture.